një intervistë që e kemi zhvilluar me Jamie Shea, I cili para 22 vitesh ishte zëdhëns I NATO-s dhe gjithsesi pjesë përbërëse e ngjarjeve të asaj kohe. Shea ka shërbyer në NATO për gati 40 vite, kurse mori famë botërore si zëdhëns I kësaj organizate gjatë kohës së luftës në Kosovë. Shea nga një zëdhëns u shndrua në një zë shprehëse për një komp të tërë dhe me shumë kënaqësi e prezantoi Jamie Shea si mysafir sonte të A23. Dear Dr. Jamie Shea, good afternoon. With highest regards from Kosovo, first of all, I would like to thank you for accepting to be with us in ATV A23 show tonight on the 22nd anniversary of beginning of NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. Mr. Shea, this date means a lot for Kosovo population. Today we mark the anniversary of the start of NATO bombing campaign. How do you look back at March of 1999?
Well, it was 22 years ago already, but I haven't changed my opinion. I still think it was the correct thing to do. I think that it was the only way to stop the repression campaign in Kosovo that was carried out by the Milosevic regime. Although, unfortunately, several people died tragically in the conflict, I still believe that because NATO launched the air campaign on March the 24th, 22 years ago, that we saved thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of lives. It would have been much, much worse for the people of Kosovo if NATO had not acted. So 22 years on, even with all of the benefit of hindsight, the benefit of history, I still think that this is one of the best things that NATO ever did in its history.
Also, can you describe maybe better for us, the younger generation, like how the bombing decision was taken?
Well, you know, NATO is not an aggressive organization. I hear today from Belgrade some newspaper reports talking about the NATO aggression against Serbia. This is simply not true. NATO tried very hard for nearly a year to reach a peaceful solution in Kosovo. We held negotiations at Rambouillet in France between the Kosovo delegation and the Serb government, Milosevic and Prime Minister Milutinovic, and we thought that we had an agreement at the end of 1998 when the Kosovar Albanians accepted the status of autonomy, they accepted the political settlement, but then the Serbs came back and said, no, we're rejecting this. We prefer to solve the Kosovo through violent action on our own terms and not in agreement with the international community. And unfortunately, in January 1999, the violence started again in Kosovo. There was a big massacre committed by Serb paramilitary forces at Račak. Over 40 people were killed. And at that moment, NATO realized that we were going towards a humanitarian disaster in Kosovo, and therefore NATO had to act. So NATO has never done anything aggressively. We tried very hard to use negotiations. Even when we did have to use force, we used it in the most limited, the most proportional way that we could. But the key thing was not to allow Kosovo to become another Bosnia, with over 100,000 people dead and all of the destruction that you saw there.
But can you tell us maybe more like how challenging was to manage the situation, describing to the public the right decision of NATO, especially after a lot of disinformation coming from Yugoslav media controlled by Milosevic regime?
Well, yeah, we had our good days and our bad days, as you would expect. And of course, the public opinion was a bit impatient because the air campaign lasted 78 days. People were hoping that it would not last for more than 1 or 2 days. And of course, we also had our bad days when, unfortunately, we hit by mistake, by accident, civilian targets and caused civilian casualties. Nobody ever wants this to happen. But you have to, of course, put those casualties in comparison with the tens of thousands of lives that I am convinced NATO saved, the people who are living today in Kosovo, who might not be living today in Kosovo if NATO had done nothing and the Milosevic regime had carried on the campaign of repression. But I will tell your viewers this, as the NATO campaign went on, public opinion became more aware of the tragedy of the people of Kosovo. Many refugees arrived in Albania, they arrived in North Macedonia, They told their stories to the international media of what they had suffered. Their houses had been burned. They had been forced to leave, taking only a minimum number of possessions. And as people heard from the Kosovo people about what was happening, I think the mood of public opinion swung behind us. And of course, in May 1999, the International Criminal War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia indicted Milosevic for war crimes. And once that happened, people could clearly see who was the aggressor and who was the defender. And therefore, I believe that we did manage to keep public opinion on our side right the way until the end.
I also mentioned in the introduction that you served in NATO for 40 years. Can you tell us how has NATO changed during that time, and what current global security threats and issues are we facing right now?
Well, that's a very good question. When I first joined NATO, it was still the Cold War, and the adversary was the Soviet Union in Central and Eastern Europe. And NATO had really just one function in those days, which was to defend the territory of the NATO member states. It was a much simpler world than what we have today. But of course, NATO has been obliged, like any institution, to adjust, to transform itself, to modernize itself as the security environment has changed. And I think today, NATO is rather like a Swiss Army knife, if you know those knives that they make in Switzerland, which have many, many different functions. And I think NATO is like that today. It still does defense and deterrence, this time against Russia. It's looking at the challenge, particularly in technology, posed by China. Today, NATO foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels. It's quite significant that on the day of the Kosovo anniversary, NATO foreign ministers are meeting. And yesterday, they approved a new NATO policy on climate change, on the NATO using its assets to deal with extreme weather events and the challenges posed by climate change. NATO recently has looked at cyber defense, at space, outer space and satellites, and the protection of satellites as a policy. It's still in Afghanistan. It's recently increased its presence in Iraq, but of course it's also still committed to the Western Balkans, and 22 years after the air campaign, KFOR is still in Kosovo today to maintain the environment of security. So NATO continues with its old functions, which are still necessary. I think the people of Kosovo want NATO to remain for a little bit longer in Kosovo until we have a full normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina. So we keep doing the things that we need to keep doing. But in addition, of course, today, NATO is looking much more globally and dealing with many new security challenges as well.
Mr. Shea, on a more personal note, after the war, of course, you visited Kosovo and you were given a hero's welcome. Did you ever think that that was going to happen? And what was your feeling in that time, and what is your feeling now?
Well, this is still, for me, a moment that, of course, I will never forget. It came as a complete surprise because, to be honest with you, and I've said this many times, when I did the NATO press conferences in Brussels, I was addressing the NATO audience, I was addressing global public opinion, I was also trying to send messages to the Milosevic regime in Belgrade, particularly regarding NATO solidarity and NATO determination. I really did not know that the people of Kosovo, while they were hiding in their houses or hiding in the woods or hiding in the mountains, were able to have access to the press conferences. And that gave them a certain sort of motivation, hope, I don't know. But at least they could see that the rescue relief was coming, that NATO was coming, and we would stop the violence soon. So I only learned that when I came to Kosovo in June 1999 after the conflict. And, for me, to be honest with you, it was a very happy, very, very proud moment. And you know this, I've kept a very big affection for Kosovo and a big interest in Kosovo and its future ever since.
You were also honored by AAB College in your last visit in Kosovo. Do you plan to visit Kosovo anytime soon?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously with this terrible COVID situation, going anywhere these days is unfortunately unbelievably difficult. And every time I hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel, we see more lockdowns and more restrictions. For example, in Belgium today, the government is meeting and maybe we're going to have more restrictions. So taking a plane and coming to Pristina is not as simple as it was. But of course, we will emerge from COVID hopefully before too long, hopefully this year. So coming to Pristina will be once again easy. And yes, as I say, I'm not just interested in the past in Kosovo, I'm more interested in the future. A new government, of course, was agreed by the parliament just this week. So there's a new departure. I'm very interested in doing what I can, particularly in the area of education, to help. So, yes, I hope that I will have opportunities, not just to contribute 22 years ago, but to contribute for the next 22 years as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shea, that you were part of A23 tonight. I won't take any much time from you because I know you are strict with your time. So thank you for being our guest speaker tonight. We really appreciate your time.
Great to talk to you. I appreciate it. And all of you in Kosovo, take good care of yourselves. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Wishing you health and all the best. U rikthyem në studio ku ndoqëm këtë intervistë të gjiruar sot më herët me ish-zëdhënsin e NATO-s, Jamie Shea. Para se të vazhdojmë në studio ku si që paralajmërova më herët për të diskutuar për 22 vjetorin e nisjes së bombardimeve të NATO-s, sonte në studio të ftuar do të jenë Sulejman Klokoqi, Besim Abazi dhe Idro Seferi. Para se të vazhdojmë në studio me bisedën, shkojmë me një blok të shkurtër marketingu.